Do you know what links the major reforms of the British government and the Cold War? It all boils down to a single defining moment in French history, the French Revolution. In the late 18th century, the French people were fed up with the nobles and the wealthy monopolizing power and decided to take matters into their own hands. They rebelled and, well, let's just say a lot of heads rolled. But this was just the beginning. The French Revolution gave birth to a whole new world of ideas, spreading across Europe and beyond. This is the Fudge Network, and in this episode we'll dive deep into one of the most important moments in human history. So, buckle up and get ready to learn. The 18th century had been a tumultuous one for Europe's major powers. France and Britain were at it again, playing their favorite game of killing each other as often and as violently as possible. This time, the brawl began when the King of Spain passed away in 1700, leaving no apparent successor to the throne. Both France and Britain got dragged into the resulting conflict, threatening to upend the balance of power in Europe. As if that wasn't enough, 40 years later, the two nations were back at it again, this time over the Austrian succession. When Archduchess Maria Theresa was denied the Austrian throne simply for being a woman, France and Britain continued their bickering, even after she ultimately took the crown. Meanwhile, across the pond, the newly formed United States was having none of Britain's taxation without representation shenanigans, and declared war in 1778. France saw this as the perfect opportunity to get back at Britain and backed the rebels. All these conflicts left France in a dire financial state, and things only got worse when King Louis XVI decided to spend money like it was going out of style, despite poor harvests and droughts plaguing the nation. As bread prices soared and the economy crumbled, the king responded by raising taxes, which only made things worse. With most of that revenue going towards debt and war, the peasants finally had enough and began rioting and refusing to work, demanding the king address the crisis. When you're so broke that you have to tax the rich, you know things have hit rock bottom. And that's exactly what happened in 1786 when Louis XVI's moneyman, Charles Alexander de Calonne, introduced a revolutionary new financial reform package. It included a universal land tax that even the wealthy were not exempt from, a groundbreaking idea for the time. But naturally, the elite weren't thrilled about this and started plotting their own rebellion. To rally support for the tax, the king called the Estates General, a fancy name for an assembly made up of the clergy, nobility, and middle classes. The peasants weren't invited, probably because they were too busy milking cows or doing whatever peasants did back then. The last time this assembly was called was way back in 1614, and a lot had changed since then. The middle class made up the bulk of the assembly, which infuriated the nobles, who still held all the power. Tensions were high, and the three groups couldn't agree on anything. But the middle class wasn't going to be silenced. They declared themselves the National Assembly and vowed to fight for equal representation and the end of the noble veto. They even met in a tennis court, which sounds pretty fancy but was actually just a convenient meeting spot. In the end, most of the clergy and a handful of nobles joined their cause, and King Louis XVI reluctantly agreed to disband the old assembly and let the new one take over. And so began one of the most important chapters in French history. It was like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode, as tensions between the nobles and the common people of Paris reached a boiling point. King Louis XVI, sensing the unrest, mobilized his army regiments and moved them into the city and surrounding areas. The people feared the worst, that the king was preparing to crush their newfound hopes for a more representative government. To make matters worse, the king dismissed the only non-noble minister who was popular with the people, Jacques Necker, on July 11, 1789. It was the last straw for Parisians, who erupted into riots and seized weapons from a military hospital. Their sights were set on the Bastille, a fortress that symbolized royal tyranny and held gunpowder stores. Bernard-René Delaunay, the governor of the Bastille, welcomed delegates from the revolutionary force, hoping to negotiate a surrender without violence. But as talks dragged on, the angry crowd outside grew restless and stormed the fortress, believing their delegates had been imprisoned inside. Chaos ensued, and Delaunay ordered his soldiers to open fire, killing 100 civilians. The people were incensed and laid siege to the fort with their heavy cannons. Delaunay was forced to surrender. He was marched down to City Hall where he was brutally murdered and his corpse decapitated. It was a bloody beginning to what would become the French Revolution. As news of the Parisian victory spread, the winds of revolution began to howl across France's countryside. Fed up with decades of oppression, peasants took to looting and torching the estates of tax collectors, landlords, and other highfalutin elites. This prompted a mass exodus of the aristocracy, who fled France like rats from a sinking ship. This time of upheaval became known as the Great Fear, and it inspired the National Assembly to formally abolish feudalism with their Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in August of 1789. This landmark document was a rallying cry for a new system of governance based on fairness and equality for all. The constitution that followed established a constitutional monarchy, giving the king a say in government decisions. However, many revolutionaries weren't happy with this compromise and demanded a grand republic instead. They even called for King Louis XVI to be put on trial for his crimes against the people. The revolutionaries' ambitions didn't stop there, as they hoped to spread their democratic ideals across Europe by declaring war on Austria and Prussia in 1792. They believed that a victory against these counter-revolutionary powers would further fuel their revolution and inspire other nations to embrace a more democratic form of government. August 10, 1792, a day that would go down in history as the arrest of King Louis XVI by a group of radical revolutionaries who were fed up with his oppressive reign. The revolutionaries demanded immediate justice for the king's past crimes against the nation and his alleged secret desires to crush the new democratic legislative assembly. In September of that same year, a wave of violence swept across the nation, leading to the disbandment of the Legislative Assembly and the establishment of a new national convention that declared the abolition of the monarchy and the birth of the French Republic. January 21, 1793 marked the sentencing of King Louis XVI to death for high treason and crimes against the state. Once mighty king was sent to the infamous guillotine, and 9 months later, his wife, Marie Antoinette, would face the same fate. Popular myth that Marie Antoinette uttered the infamous line, "Let them eat cake," when told that the peasants had no bread to eat is just that, a myth. France's revolutionary spirit reached a boiling point with a blood-soaked terror that raged for 10 months, where even a whiff of dissent could land you on the chopping block. This unbridled mayhem caused another revolution known as the Thermadorian reaction. The National Convention, reeling from the unrest, decided to hand executive power to a directory of 5 people, handpicked by Parliament. The new regime was met with resistance, which was quickly quashed by the French military. Enter the man, the myth, the legend, Napoleon Bonaparte. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows with Napoleon at the helm. The Directory was a disaster, propped up by military might, paving the way for Napoleon to declare himself emperor. He then ignited a series of wars that nearly cost France its independence. Why do you think the French had such a hard time getting the hang of democracy? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fantastic content.